Welcome to Iceland. Last summer, every NATO ally agreed to spend 3.5% of GDP on core defense, with one unambiguous exception: Iceland. And even though Iceland spends about 0.0% of GDP on core defense, no one seems to mind. And while you might think that Iceland's dazzling beauty may have stunned everyone into submission, that is not the case. Iceland spending almost nothing on core defense is by design. And it actually takes advantage of one of the main benefits of being a part of NATO. And it makes Iceland NATO's key Arctic asset. So join me today as I walk around the island trying to understand why.
Now that I am back in the hot heat of my recording studio, let's set the scene for Iceland's security choices by diving into its central historical challenge. In the aftermath of World War I, the island formed a personal union with Denmark, having full sovereignty, but recognizing the Danish king and deferring foreign affairs to Denmark. That worked great until World War II broke out. Denmark declared itself neutral, but that did not stop Nazi Germany from invading and occupying the country on April 9, 1940. Iceland also declared itself neutral, but the Allied powers did not find that position compelling. Britain, in particular, worried that Germany would occupy the island, which sat at a critical position for maritime trade, and was also helpful for predicting weather patterns in Europe. Churchill therefore sought to convince Iceland to join the Allies. Not everyone in Iceland was convinced, though, so Churchill did the perfectly diplomatic thing in response. He invaded Iceland. There were mixed feelings about this decision on the island. As far as invasions go, this one was relatively benign, and many enjoyed the insurance against a Nazi takeover. British troops showed up on May 10th. Iceland filed official protests but did not resist. And while the island's government maintained an official policy of neutrality, it de facto cooperated with the invasion force. For the next year, British and Canadian forces set up defenses and built up Iceland's infrastructure, including Reykjavik Airport. The airport remains operating today to handle domestic flights, and you can still see the remnants of some of the defensive fortifications that the British built into the hilltops adjacent to the airport. Churchill's arrangement lasted just over a year. It turns out that the Prime Minister was a bit busy with what was happening over in continental Europe, and so the United Kingdom, the United States, and Iceland reached an agreement to transfer responsibility of Icelandic security to the United States, which was still a neutral country at the time. Again, despite being an occupation, the relationship was cooperative. The United States also invested in Iceland's infrastructure, including what would become Keflavik International Airport, which is the main hub that non-Icelanders travel through. In fact, perhaps the most contentious part of the relationship was something that became known as the situation. U.S. soldiers stationed there equaled about 25% of the Icelandic population. Shockingly, this abundance of American men in their 20s wanted to get a good look at the women of Iceland. The situation aside, eventually the war ended. Iceland emerged as a fully independent nation, having terminated its personal union with Denmark, but one of the allies turned into a security threat of a different kind. It turns out that the enemy of my enemy is not my friend. It is still the Soviet Union, and it is still seeking to expand. A continued occupation of Iceland was not going to be a reasonable solution. Two arrangements arose to take its place. First was the 1949 signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. Becoming a charter member of NATO ended any question about Iceland's former position of neutrality. Second was the 1951 bilateral security agreement with the United States. For our purposes today, there were two key components of this. One, the United States will take charge of the defense of Iceland on behalf of NATO. And two, Iceland is responsible for providing the facilities necessary for that defense free of charge. After 75 years, this arrangement has evolved a bit. The United States left its main base on the island in 2006 as a part of the general post-Cold War drawdown, plus Washington's own distractions with what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iceland has also started to develop some of its own capabilities, though those efforts remain secondary. Thus, we need to explain why Iceland defers its defense to others, and why others are happy to step up in its place. On Iceland's end, the problem is size. Iceland is so small that it is almost exactly the size of Kentucky, and actually a little bit smaller than Bulgaria. Iceland is so small that its population is about the same size as Anchorage, Alaska's metropolitan area, roughly 400,000 people. Iceland is so small that its phone numbers are 7 digits. The closest thing that you can find to an area code is its country code. Iceland is so small that when it made the World Cup in 2018, about 10% of the country left to attend. Notably, the tournament that year was in Russia. Oops. Iceland is so small that none of its athletes have ever won a medal in the Winter Olympics. But Iceland is so small that it gets to compete in the Games of the Small States of Europe, which is a real athletic competition. Bet you thought I was making that one up. Iceland is so small that it did not build its first indoor skating rink until 1997. Iceland is so small that the normally sized invasive rabbits can grow to such absurd sizes that I briefly thought that a coyote may be about to attack me. Iceland is so small that the country does not have a Ministry of Defense. It has a Defense Directorate housed within the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And instead of having a Defense Secretary, it has a Director General of the Directorate. Love that job title. Iceland is so small that you can see this church from basically everywhere in its capital. Iceland is so small that this one stand serves the equivalent of 1 hot dog per Icelander every 3 years. Iceland is so small that its parliament can meet in this building. Iceland is so small that they have a website to check to make sure that you are not pulling a Fallout and getting a little too friendly with a cousin. Iceland is so small that they can sustain a conspiracy that they eat rotten shark just so they can get unsuspecting foreigners to try it. Iceland is so small that a man once sailed to it, captured its governor, declared himself in charge, and actually got away with it for about 2 months. But most of all, Iceland is so small that its GDP is only about $33 billion, and that is despite having one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world. Remember that NATO allies intend to spend 5% of GDP across all military categories, with 3.5% reserved for core defense and 1.5% applicable to other categories. Well, 5% of $33 billion is $1.66 billion. By comparison, the USS Gerald R. Ford cost $13.3 billion to build. At a 5% rate, it would take Iceland about 8 years to build a modern carrier, and that is assuming that the government spends literally nothing on the rest of its military. Forget about the fighter jets that are supposed to staff it. Forget about maintenance, and forget about personnel. In fact, ignoring actual personnel staff, just operating the Ford costs $1.5 billion per year. Now, obviously, if Iceland were to start building a military tomorrow, it would not put an aircraft carrier at the top of its list. However, this does raise a general problem with operating a military at all. There are certain fixed costs that you have to pay before you get any usable military power. And if you do not have much money to spend, you will never overcome the fixed cost problem. It is similar to why Europe's defense industrial base is in a bad position. When European countries cut way back on military spending at the end of the Cold War, which coincidentally is sometimes marked by the Reykjavik summit held in this mansion, there were insufficient funds to keep the factories operating. That is how Europe ended up procuring too much from US firms. As a result, it does not make sense for Iceland to develop a military in a normal sense. However, this situation, involving Iceland's lack of military spending, not US GIs getting Icelandic curious, does create a security vulnerability. Welcome to what is called the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, with Iceland notably in the center. Any Russian submarines from the Arctic Fleet need to pass through there, after which they will become threats to the Western Hemisphere, Africa, or elsewhere. I need not tell you that Iceland lacks the funds to build a counter-submarine program. Similarly, the fastest way for Russian fighter jets to get to the Western Hemisphere is to go over the Arctic Circle. Same for intercontinental ballistic missiles, which would transition us quickly from very cold to very hot. Putting the two pieces together, you have a country that cannot adequately defend itself, yet is simultaneously the key piece of real estate in all sorts of security matters. What to do? Well, the West's solution was to implement the most extreme form of strategic complementarities that NATO has ever seen. Strategic complementarities is a fancy-sounding phrase, but all it really means is that me building a piece of military technology makes my ally want to build a piece of military technology, which reinforces my decision, which reinforces his decision, and so forth. It basically flips the notion of free riding on its head. You spending money increases my desire to spend money, not the reverse. How could there be complementarities in Iceland when the country spends almost nothing on its military? Well, the solution to the general security problem is to treat Iceland as the world's most powerful aircraft carrier. Stationary, perhaps, but one need not move a carrier when it is already in the right position. In that light, Iceland's role here is to keep the aircraft carrier running. This is not a military task. It is a pure infrastructure task. Icelanders live on the island, and so it is comparatively cheap for them to run the infrastructure, as compared to having Europeans or Americans take on that task. Following the Hague Summit, it was fashionable to mock the additional 1.5% of GDP for miscellaneous expenses as a joke, something that Trump could tout as a larger number, but was devoid of true meaning. Well, no one thinks that having infrastructure in Iceland is a joke. I am literally talking about keeping the lights on, and just making sure there is a place for soldiers to get food. Probably more lamb and less shark. More substantively, it also means maintaining a coast guard. Not one necessarily capable of repelling a Russian invasion force, but more to cover search and rescue operations, in case something happens to a visiting fighter over the water. The benefit to the other allies is that they will always have a place to stay should there be a threat to address in the Arctic. For the duration of the Cold War, this was the United States assuming the primary responsibility. As I alluded to earlier, Keflavik not only became Iceland's primary international airport, U.S. Armed Forces also built out an airbase adjacent to it. Then there are 4 key radar installations, one on each corner of the island, which also expanded the Allied observation of Soviet movements. After the Cold War ended, the United States began planning a drawdown from the base, following an earlier transfer of the radar system. Indeed, U.S. troops departed Keflavik in 2006 due to the aforementioned shifting priorities in Washington, with Iceland further absorbing responsibility to maintain Keflavik's infrastructure. It is the type of thing that will happen in other European settings over the next decade, as the United States shifts its geopolitical interests eastward. Today, Keflavik hosts rotating air police missions from NATO allies. Participating countries stay only 2 or 3 months at a time. Sweden, as we saw at the beginning of the video, is the current occupant, and I was in the first media group to visit them on base. It also marked Sweden's first swift response mission as NATO's newest member. The guests benefit from their time in Iceland because there is relatively little civilian air traffic nearby. That gives the visiting air forces greater latitude, at a higher latitude, to conduct exercises. However, these are not tripwire forces. They rotate out, and there is not constant Allied coverage in Iceland. Air emergencies during these gap periods have to be covered by Norway, or perhaps Bedufik Space Base in Greenland if rotational US forces just so happen to be there at the time. You could imagine the gap in Iceland-specific coverage is the type of thing that might change as the Arctic warms and becomes a bigger part of the geopolitical picture. All told, this role as an unsinkable aircraft carrier means that Iceland commands greater influence in NATO than either its population or military spending would suggest. To wit, in the midst of the Cold War, the United Kingdom and Iceland fought various cod wars against each other. As the name suggests, the dispute was over fishing rights. A major part of how Iceland emerged victorious was by threatening to withdraw from NATO if the United Kingdom did not back down. NATO indeed brokered an agreement, and that was the end of that. This cod, by the way, was the best fish that I've ever eaten in my life. I suppose that makes sense. Looking to the future, I mentioned that Iceland's core defense spending is roughly 0.0% of GDP. But that may be changing. By some measures, in recent years, it has gone as high as 0.2% of GDP. Perhaps not a lot, but it is also not nothing. And there are discussions to bump that amount to 1.5% of GDP. The Directorate for Security is expanding, and there are clear opportunities for Iceland to play a more active role in security affairs. As a historical legacy of World War II, Iceland began to specialize in ordnance disposal, and especially sea mines. Nah, what am I saying? No one would ever have use for sea mine clearance anymore. Where was I? Right, Iceland's expanding military and infrastructure. Iceland has a fuel depot northeast of the airport that figures to soon have many more visitors, and thus there is need for an expansion. The country already hosts the annual Northern Viking exercises, which test preparation for naval and air operations in the region, like submarine hunting. Perhaps surprisingly, Iceland took part in Allied operations in Afghanistan, staying true to type by filling logistical roles. As we continue to live in a world at war, you could imagine more such opportunities will soon be available. Iceland has also recently acquired an interest in cybersecurity. Being an island is great for physical security, but the stopping power of water has little stopping power on the digital front. On that tech front, you might remember that my main purpose in Iceland was to attend an Allied Command Transformation Hackathon, indeed hosted by the island's government. It was not that long ago that Iceland contributed to Ukraine's survival by simply writing checks for $135 million. Because when your comparative advantage is just being rich, that is the efficient solution. But that is changing as we transition to a new era of international security. If you want to learn more about NATO's political and military structures, I have an entire playlist on the subject. Go check it out. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.